Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for this webinar is implementing expanded RPSs in Oregon and Rhode Island. This webinar is a presentation of the RPS Collaborative, which is managed by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. Our host for this webinar is Executive Director Warren Leon, and we have two excellent guest speakers with us today from Oregon and Rhode Island. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants in this webinar are in listen-only mode. That means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. You have a couple of options to tune into the audio portion of this webinar. You can use a computer mic and speakers, or you can call in using a telephone. There's some instructions on your screen for how to do that. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will read through your questions as they come in, and we will get to as many as we can as time allows at the end of the webinar. So to make sure that we get to your question, please type it in as you think of it. Don't wait until the end. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar, as well as all of CESA's previous webinars from the RPS Collaborative, on our website at cesa.org/webinars. And we will also send you a follow-up email sometime this afternoon with a link to the webinar recording and the slides. And with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Warren Leon.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. Let me first say something about CESA. We're an organization of state agencies and other entities that are interested in advancing clean energy, primarily in the electricity sector, and you could see our members on this screen. It's a great group of organizations, and if you're in another organization and want to see how you can get involved in CESA, let us know. If we could go to the next slide, one of the things we do as CESA is we manage the RPS Collaborative on behalf of the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy, who fund the RPS Collaborative. And this is a vehicle for allowing state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, and other stakeholders to exchange information and ideas about what's going on in the wonderful world of RPSs, and there's generally always a lot going on. We do webinars like this one. We have an annual summit in Washington, D.C. We have a monthly newsletter which talks about what's going on in different states related to RPSs, and all this could be yours for free if you just sign up at the link below or go to our website to get on the mailing list for the RPS Collaborative. Thanks. If we can go to the next slide. Today, we're focusing on two states that have relatively recently taken action to expand and extend their RPSs. There was action in quite a few states over the past 18 months to expand and extend their RPSs, and two notable places that did that were Oregon and Rhode Island. And today we're going to hear about what those states did and how they're going about implementing their newly improved RPS. I'm going to introduce Linda George now, who's going to speak about Rhode Island, and then after she speaks, I will tell you a little bit about Rebecca Smith, who's going to talk about Oregon. Well, Linda George relatively recently joined the staff of the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission as Senior Legal Counsel, and there she concentrates on electric and water regulation. She previously spent 12 years working for the Rhode Island Senate, focusing on energy and environmental policy and issues. She was also the attorney for the Committee on Environment and Agriculture. Earlier, Linda was an attorney in the Civil Division of the Rhode Island Department of Attorney General, and she worked in private practice focusing on insurance defense work. She received a BA in government from Dartmouth College and graduated from Rhode Island Law School. And she's going to tell us about the Rhode Island RPS and how they're proceeding to implement it. So Linda, you're on.
Thank you, Warren. Good afternoon, all, and thank you, Warren and Sessa, for hosting this webinar and for the opportunity to present today on Rhode Island's Renewable Energy Standard. It's also called the RPS in other states, but for my presentation, I'll use the term RES. First, I'm going to describe Rhode Island's original RES, and then the recent legislation expanding the standard, and finally, I'll discuss implementation, including policies and programs that support the RES and trends going forward. I apologize for that. So first, I'll begin with a little background. Rhode Island was the first to restructure retail electricity. The mandate applies to all retail electrical energy suppliers. This includes Rhode Island's major distribution company, National Grid, and competitive suppliers. In Rhode Island, National Grid composes about 65% of the load. Competitive suppliers account for about 32% of the load, and two small exempt utilities have the remaining 2%. The RES was enacted in 2004 and began in 2007 with a modest 3% of retail sales. The original standard increased incrementally to 16% in 2019. After that date, the percent is maintained, subject to the Public Utilities Commission review. The legislation also requires that no more than 2% can come from existing resources each year, and the legislation allowed 2 years of banking of excess new RECs. The original standard authorized the PUC to delay the annual increase if it determines that there is an actual or potential inadequate supply of renewable energy. In 2015, the Commission delayed the scheduled 1.5% increase, citing the availability and cost of renewable energy supplies. This reduced Rhode Island's final target to 14.5% by 2019. In 2016, the last session, the General Assembly, with the support of the Governor, enacted legislative amendments to the RES, which expanded and extended this standard. The legislation does two things. First, it expands the RES by continuing the current 1.5% annual increases in the renewable energy requirement over an additional 5-year period through 2035. This establishes a new final target of 38.5%. The second thing the legislation did was modify the PUC review by authorizing the Commission to review the adequacy of supply every 5 years. And it maintains authority to delay annual increases or recommend a revised schedule to the General Assembly on a finding that renewable energy supplies are inadequate. The legislation removed from the PUC the consideration of the potential inadequacy of supply. In 2016, the General Assembly passed additional legislation impacting the RES and concerning non-regulated power producers. First, a little background. In 2013 and 2014, 2 competitive energy suppliers filed for bankruptcy and left outstanding obligation of over 4,000 megawatts. This effect will span into 2015. The value of this obligation is about $278,000. So while not a large amount of money considering our renewable energy standard, it raised some red flags. Rhode Island did not meet its RES target for these years. For example, in 2014, we met the target by 99.3%. The legislation enacted in 2016 now requires competitive suppliers to provide financial surety as a condition of licensing. So should these competitive suppliers go into bankruptcy, there is funds available to satisfy their RES obligations. Now I'm going to turn to implementation of the RES and look at alternative compliance payments. An obligated entity in Rhode Island, either National Grid or a competitive supplier, may meet its RES obligation by retiring RECs or making alternative compliance payments. The ACP acts as a price cap for the RECs. Currently, the cost of an ACP is $67 per megawatt hour, and that's for compliance year 2016. This is adjusted annually with the Consumer Price Index. The ACPs are paid to the Rhode Island's Commerce Corporation, which sets these funds aside for the Renewable Energy Fund. This fund supports the development of renewable energy projects and helps create a supply of new RECs. In 2014, nearly 100% of the state's existing RES obligation was met through retiring RECs. Only 3 entities made ACPs of about $48,000 in lieu of retiring their RECs. This is in contrast to 2011, where ACP payments reached $5.25 million, and in 2012, where we saw $2.25 million of ACP payments go to the Renewable Energy Fund. New and existing RECs, minted, purchased, and settled. Oops, excuse me, I'm sorry for that. New and existing RECs, minted and purchased, and settled for compliance year 2014 were generated by 6 types of renewable energy sources. As you can see from the pie chart, landfill gas was the majority at 44%, followed by biomass at 30%, and wind around 12%. In terms of location, most of the new RECs were sourced from Rhode Island. This represents an increase in new RECs. You'll see the 44% of new RECs sourced from Rhode Island. This is an increase from prior years where we saw up to 1/3 of new RECs sourced in Rhode Island. This change in geographic location is largely driven by one project, a landfill gas generation plant next to the state's central landfill in Johnston, Rhode Island. This became operational in May of 2013. The plant owner signed a power purchase agreement with National Grid, which included the sale of RECs, all of which were used to satisfy National Grid's RES obligation in 2014, and that accounts for the increased new REC source from Rhode Island. Now I'd like to turn to Rhode Island policies and laws that support the RES. First is long-term contracts. This law requires that 90 megawatts of capacity, which is not nameplate, but capacity factor, requires National Grid to contract up to 90 megawatts of capacity factor through PPAs, power purchase agreements. 2 examples of these contracts are the Rhode Island Landfill Gas Project, which I just explained, and a new project, the Block Island Wind Farm, which is a 5-turbine, 30-megawatt project off the coast of Rhode Island. It's the first offshore wind project in the U.S., and National Grid signed a PPA, which includes the sale of RECs from this project. There are other facilities in New York, and it's important to note that not all 90 megawatts are operational at this time. Other laws and policies that support the Renewable Energy Standard include a fixed rate feed-in tariff called the Renewable Energy Growth Program. National Grid procures all the RECs from projects that are in this feed-in tariff program. The Renewable Energy Fund is another policy that supports the RES, and it provides grants and loans to help develop renewable energy projects. And as I explained, that's funded through through ACPs and a nominal surcharge on most customers' electricity bills. Another piece of legislation is the Affordable Clean Energy Security Act. That facilitates national grids' participation in regional purchasing of clean energy projects. We also have a state pilot program that provides 30 megawatt capacity of statewide community remote net metering and shared solar projects. There is no cap on remote net metering for public entities. And then the other pieces of legislation helped facilitate distributed generation in Rhode Island. That includes third-party ownership of net metering projects. We've also established a statewide tax rate for commercial renewable energy systems, and we've exempted residential renewable energy systems and those used in manufacturing from taxation. And finally, interconnection is approved by the PUC through a tariff. In conclusion, I'd like to identify a few trends. First, the number of facilities certified under the Rhode Island RES continues to increase. Second, the supply of and demand for new RECs were near equilibrium for 2014. And third, load growth in this state and the region is low in the near term. There is a potential for these three trends to continue in the near term, although it should be noted that electrical load growth is expected to increase in the long term. All states in the region now have an RPS standard. Regional renewable demand will increase dramatically by 2025. The supply growth should continue as renewable policy initiatives of each New England state takes hold. And finally, I want to note that ISO New England stakeholders, including states, are discussing ways to integrate public policy which supports renewables, integrate that with wholesale markets in the long term. This last page is a link to the statutes and the bills that I discussed and other references. And that concludes my PowerPoint. If you have questions, feel free to contact me or my colleague, Todd Bianco, and I've included my contact information. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Linda. And folks on the call, you can also just type in your questions, and after we hear the second presentation about Oregon, we will be asking questions of both of the speakers. So type in your questions at any time. So we're going to switch to Oregon in a minute, but let me tell you a little bit about our speaker, Rebecca Smith. She's a senior policy analyst at the Oregon Department of Energy, where she focuses on the state's renewable portfolio standard, on environmental attributes, and on emerging renewable energy technologies and markets. She also chairs the Oregon Portfolio Options Committee, which is an advisory body to the Oregon Public Utility Commission for the state's voluntary renewable power programs. Prior to joining the State Department of Energy, Rebecca worked on greenhouse gas mitigation policy, project development, corporate climate risk management, and energy efficiency at several different organizations, including Earth Advantage Institute and EcoSecurities. She has an MPA degree in environmental science and policy from the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and she got her BA from Grinnell College. So, Rebecca, tell us about Oregon.
Good morning, everyone, or rather good afternoon, depending on where you are, and thank you, Warren. As Warren indicated, I am with the Oregon Department of Energy, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about the Oregon Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS. We have had some legislative changes of late, and so I'm going to talk about what the original RPS looked like, as well as what the new targets entail, as well as some related legislation that may affect compliance, and then what some of our strategies are currently and what they could be in the future for meeting these new targets. So we have had an RPS in Oregon since 2007, and we have what should be a familiar stair-step approach with targets that increase incrementally over the years. We started at 5% of all retail electricity sales coming from renewable energy sources in 2011, and increasing every 5 years to top out at 25% by 2025. Part of the negotiation of the RPS included setting a commercial operation date, or COD, of January 1, 1995 for facilities. There are a few types of facilities that are grandfathered into that, but primarily post-1995 facilities are what are eligible. And then we use Regis to track all of our recs. So there are a number of flexibility mechanisms that were baked into Oregon's RPS, and our new RPS legislation has changed a few of these, and I've shaded those here in this table. But I wanted to give you a sense of what the options are that utilities have in complying with the RPS. And these include a 4% cost cap, which is essentially the utility does not have to apply with the RPS to the extent that they will exceed that 4% of their annual revenue requirement. We also have an ACP, and the RPS for a time did allow unlimited banking of RECs. That's changed with our new legislation. We do have a 20% cap on the use of unbundled certificates, and that's for our IOUs, or investor-owned utilities. And then there's a delayed path for smaller utilities that then grow into a larger share of the state's overall retail sales. So since there's a lot of variation among states in how an RPS is administrated, I wanted to give you a quick overview of how we accomplish this in Oregon. My agency, ODO, we certify facilities as eligible for the RPS, and as part of that we offer technical support. And additionally, we gather, and in concert with the state of Washington, we report data on Oregon's statewide electricity resource mix. The Oregon Public Utility Commission, or the PUC, as I will refer to them as, provide the greatest deal of oversight with respect to the RPS. Our investor-owned utilities, or IOUs, report to them both with RPS implementation plans as well as with annual RPS compliance plans. The PUC also sets the ACP, and they manage as well that cost compliance cost methodology and the correct uses therein. Consumer-owned utilities, or COUs, do not report to the PUC, so instead they are providing their RPS compliance information to their respective boards. So looking at how compliance has gone thus far, for 2015 we saw a jump from a 5% target that utilities, IOUs, had in 2014 to a 15% target in 2015. We have two big IOUs here in Oregon. We've got Portland General Electric, or PGE, and PacifiCorp. And shown in this table is that they are well within that 4% cost cap, especially PacifiCorp, and then also shows how both have chosen to maximize that 20% unbundled REC cap. It's worth noting as well that both of these IOUs are sitting on large portfolios of bundled and unbundled RECs, and depending on their compliance strategies, they really don't need to worry about RPS compliance or struggling to comply, at least until 2020 and then later. Of course, that's not to say that IOUs are not on the lookout for opportunistic, cheap, unbundled RECs or potential new sources of generation. So, big changes. SB 1547, which passed last year, this was a big piece of energy legislation with ramifications beyond the RPS. It essentially cemented Oregon's commitment to renewable energy, primarily by phasing out all coal of the state's electricity mix by 2030. We in Oregon, we only have one in-state coal-fired facility, Boardman, and that's already slated to close and or switch to a different fuel source by 2020. So this 2016 legislation was primarily then restricting as well coal-by-wire from neighboring states. There were a number of provisions in here that were very directly applicable to the RPS. First and foremost was it doubled our RPS targets to 50% by 2040. If you may remember, our earlier targets had been 25%. So it also removed some of the flexibility mechanisms, primarily the use of unbundled banking of RECs. It did add a new type of eligibility to the cost cap calculation, specifically energy storage costs, and it added a new flexibility mechanism, which was a reliability safety valve. Utilities are temporarily exempted from RPS compliance. If doing so will negatively impact their reliability vis-a-vis their NERC agreements. And it also added a new type of eligible RPS generation, which was thermal energy produced from biomass-fired electricity production. So this offers us an opportunity to kind of look at the original targets side by side with the new targets. So as you can see in red, Oregon's RPS was originally going to top out at 25% at 2025. We've now doubled that to 50% in 2040. And if you look at that farthest right column, you can see that we've got some inconsistent jumps in increments to get there, everything from 7% to, you see the biggest jump of 10% between 2030 and 2035. So as mentioned, a big change as well from this legislation was a change in REC banking rules. Gone are the days of unlimited REC banking for all. And then for our IOUs, before we also had a provision that first in, first out for RECs in terms of retiring them. So with our new rules, we now consider any RECs in one's portfolio that are from before the time of this legislation. We're calling them golden RECs. Essentially means that they never go bad. They never expire. So these days, only COUs still enjoy unlimited banking of RECs. For our IOUs, we now have 5 REC freshness categories, and those are based on the commencement operation date of the facility, as well as a few other factors. And those provide essentially expiration dates in 5-year increments for those RECs. And then for IOUs and ESSs, it did remove that first in, first out provision. Those COUs are still bound by that. So, excellent. How are we going to meet these targets? One of our first options is to continue with business as usual. And by this I mean, staying with what's worked thus far. Utilities continue the process of filing RPS implementation plans with the PUC, wherein they provide their rationale for their approach to the use of unbundled RECs, whether and when they want to add new generation resources, and what their projected cost of compliance will be each year. As part of this process, stakeholders evaluate these compliance plans with respect to how the costs of compliance are calculated, how these costs inform strategy, any plans for RFPs for new generation or for unbundled RECs, any of the inherent assumptions in the plan, and how the RPS implementation plans interact with the overall IRP process. Certainly, as we have used this approach thus far, a constant source of discussion has been the unbundled REC market, which has a very great deal of opacity and variable costs that make calculating out future costs of compliance a little tricky. So this approach, it's one that's worked well for Oregon thus far. As you can see from an earlier slide, our utilities are handily meeting their targets right now. However, it does have its drawbacks, and namely that it doesn't explicitly address a lot of the barriers and opportunities related to renewable energy and RPS compliance. And as our RPS targets get beefier, we're going to start bumping up against a lot of these barriers to attainment with greater frequency. This is a wall of text explaining some of these barriers. So putting more renewables on the grid entails solving a lot of different problems. One in particular is issues around load imbalances associated with renewables that are intermittent. I'm sure that you are all familiar with the duck curve. Here in Oregon, we're actually more susceptible to seasonal imbalances than diurnal, but load imbalances nonetheless are certainly an area of concern, which in turn raises the question of energy storage and the costs and the technology associated with wide-scale deployment of storage. Then you start talking about pushes to electrify more of our transportation, especially private vehicles. This in turn raises the interrelated question regarding current and potential future climate or greenhouse gas mitigation related policies. A lot of studies out there looking at the best scenarios for reaching an economy-wide deep decarbonization really posit that we should be moving as much as we can to electrify as much as we can. So that raises more questions. And then here come demand response and smart grid. So a big factor here in Oregon with our cost cap are the costs associated with compliance. And a lot of these issues here provide great sources of uncertainty. There's also federal policy. We've got certainty on the phasing out of the PTC and the ITC, but certainly uncertainty around subsidies for both renewable and traditional fuels and other potentials raised by a changing federal administration. And then as kind of a more philosophical question, I would say, is what is an RPS and what isn't it? Should an RPS focused on renewable electricity also address energy efficiency or transportation fuels or renewable natural gas used for non-electricity generation purposes? RPS legislation has proven pretty successful, and thus we've seen a number of instances where an RPS may be legislated to meet more and more diverse policy goals, and this certainly raises questions as to the effect of the efficacy of RPS legislation to meet the overarching goal of supporting development of new renewable energy resources and removing more and more traditional fossil fuels from an electricity portfolio. So, with all of these interrelated questions in mind, this leads us to another option for RPS compliance. I like to call it a new hope. If you are not a Star Wars fan, you may refer to it as a new framework. And this is a ideas for an approach that really seeks to take all of those barriers, opportunities, trends, and unknowns, and to map how they're interrelated and to better understand those relationships. This would in turn provide some clarity on what policies might need to happen first and in a stepwise fashion versus maybe which policies are complements and should really be happening in concert. The approach here would also seek to identify the great many stakeholders involved. That would include other state agencies, utilities, naturally, advocates for everything from renewable energy to equity and social justice to economic development, research organizations, and so on, with the express purpose of better understanding who's doing what, who has what data, getting a sense of areas of overlap, certainly identifying potential gaps, and really better understanding any frisson between our short-term policy goals and our longer-term goals. This all in turn would provide some pretty detailed grist to develop some scenario analyses and to then refine any approach. So which way is Oregon going to go? Certainly, at least in the short term, I anticipate we'll be much heavier on the side of going with what's worked for us thus far. The new framework that I've suggested here, that level of cooperation, the level of detail needed for any sort of useful analysis, that's a heavy lift. And as mentioned, at least here in Oregon, we are in good terms right now in terms of meeting our targets in the short term. That said, we certainly appreciate all of those interrelated barriers and opportunities and the what those mean for our medium and longer term goals, especially as related to RPS attainment. And so as we look towards developing a new framework, a huge part of that is going to be collaboration and better understanding those issues, as well as really working with a number of stakeholders with, a myriad of needs, sometimes competing. And so I certainly look forward to working with all of you here, learning with you, sharing best practices as we start this journey on, seeking to explore how to develop a more robust model for RPS attainment. And that is my presentation today. Thank you.
Warren, you might be muted.
Thank you, Rebecca and Linda. Those were two very good presentations that gave us a good picture of what's going on in the two states. A number of questions have come in. I'll be asking those, but there's probably still opportunity for a few additional questions. But let me go to some that came in. First, Rebecca, unbundled RECs. Are there any geographic restrictions on those, or could one of the utilities purchase RECs from anywhere in the country?
Thank you, Warren, and that is a great question. So for our RPS, we allow unbundled RECs from within the WEC, or the Western Electricity, I forgot what my acronym stands for. Coordinating Council, thank you. So WEC-wide unbundled RECs are eligible for the Oregon RPS.
Okay, and Linda, this is a somewhat similar question. Are there any portions of the RPS in Rhode Island that require RECs to come from within state? Because it seemed like a high percentage of the RECs that you're getting and a high percentage of RPS compliance is from in-state projects. Was that based on a requirement, or is just the way it's worked out?
No, Warren, there's no requirement for a percentage. Thank you for the question first. There's no requirement for a certain percentage of RECs from in-state. The law requires that RECs come from the NEPOOL GIS region or ISO New England. National Grid, the largest utility, really our only significant utility, has procured a lot of the RECs through PPAs, both regionally and within Rhode Island. And I'd say that's where the vast majority come from to date.
Good. Well, as you'll see from this question, we got a bunch of questions that had to do with the geography of compliance with the RPS. And this is a question for both of you. And this person asks, Is it perceived in your state as overall beneficial to be purchasing RECs from out of state, or is there any concern that or sentiment that all the RPS should be supplied in state, or is there just not a lot of debate on this geography question? Who wants to go first?
Warren, this is Rebecca from Odo. I'll tackle that first. It certainly has been an area of debate, and there are certainly stakeholders in the state who are concerned about the economic impact to Oregon for the importation of RECs. That said, we're certainly very cognizant of not wanting to run afoul of interstate commerce rules. And I would say that actually we've had more discussion around the commercial operation date eligibility for facilities than we have for the geographic area. Thank you.
And how about Linda? What's the attitude towards in-state versus out-of-state in Rhode Island?
Well, Warren, in Rhode Island, we have a lot of programs and policies that I mentioned on one of the later slides that really support in-state renewables. Our legislature and governor see that as an opportunity to drive our economy, grow green industries, renewable energy industries. And National Grid is obligated to support a lot of those in-state programs through the purchase of RECs. But out-of-state contracts for renewable energy resources and those RECs tend to be cheaper. It is a balancing act, but I would say there's not a discrimination against out-of-state RECs, but we view in-state RECs as a reflection of a strengthening economy in the green industries, and we are supporting job growth in that area. And a lot of the policies and procedures on the last page, the second to the last page, really were passed recently in a comprehensive look by the General Assembly and the governor to spur our economy. So I wouldn't say that we compete. It's more of a different benefits, lower cost for a REC versus in-state economic development.
Great. And your comments at the end where you talked about all the policies that came in place recently leads to another question someone asked that's a question for both of you. And it says, look, last year was a big year for legislation and policy change in your states. Looking forward to 2017, do you see that it's likely or possible that there will be additional policy changes and additional legislation that relate to renewable energy in your state?
Warren, this is Rebecca.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Go on.
Okay. We are certainly starting to see the bills that are coming in for our legislative session this year, and there's certainly more time for more to be introduced, but at this time I would say that most of the bills we're seeing are more focused on doing some cleanup and clarification to our really big energy bill last year. And so in my entirely unscientific opinion, I would expect that to continue to be the trend. However, it's always possible that we could also see some legislation for some much more material changes related to energy. But certainly, as I said, what we've seen is more related to last year's bill and making sure that all the provisions in it are clear and workable.
Okay. Warren, I would have been in a better position to answer that question when I still worked for the Senate. To be honest with you, but we have not seen any new bills. Rhode Island, like Oregon, had some pretty comprehensive energy legislation last year, although I wouldn't be surprised. There were a couple of bills that didn't pass, but not enormous game changers. I wouldn't be surprised if we see them in terms of extending the feed-in tariff program. But I would say we did a lot last year, and I haven't seen, it's still very early in the session, so we'll wait and see.
Good. Before I go further, I do want to respond to one question. We will definitely be sending out a link to the slides for this webinar and also to a recording of the webinar. I have several questions that came in for Rebecca. One, you talked about the change from unlimited banking to more restricted banking. Was that because there had been problems with unlimited banking?
Warren, I wouldn't say that we had problems per se. It was simply more directed towards providing a little bit more heft to robustness to the targets. And that unlimited rec banking had been a really important flexibility mechanism in the early days of meeting the RPS. But certainly, as I mentioned, we have two large investor-owned utilities who have, very respectably large portfolios of RECs right now, and for their RPS compliance, they're really not in the immediate term needing to bring on new sources of generation or to procure new RECs. And so it's possible that removal of unlimited banking may have been towards addressing that, but I certainly wouldn't say that we had any problems. And this is certainly a trend that we've seen in other states, that as they've adopted more robust RPS targets, that they've started to fine-tune their flexibility mechanisms.
Okay. In the Northeast, Rhode Island has been involved in a multi-state RFP to secure and help develop renewable energy projects. Rebecca, has there been any consideration of multi-state efforts in the Northwest or the West Coast more broadly for states to work together to procure renewable energy development?
That's a great question, and honestly, I would have to say that I don't know. I know that we collaborate quite a bit in general with Washington State, California, certainly, other neighbors as well. And we are very curious as to how our neighbors are going to approach their RPS compliance. But I have to say that I am not aware of any multi-state efforts at procurement at this time. It's very possible that some exist and I don't know about them. So if there is someone who is interested in following up with me via email, which is on my presentation, I'm happy to delve into that a little bit farther and get some more information.
Great. And I have another question for you, Rebecca. This in part goes back to the geography issue. Can you give a sense of what percentage of the renewable energy that's used to support the Oregon RPS comes from within state? And also, what are the main types of generation technologies that are used to support the RPS?
Well, for generation types, it's certainly the usual suspects. We've very heavy on wind and solar. We're actually seeing more development of solar these days, but quite a lot of wind in the region. And then we have smaller percentages of things like geothermal, landfill gas, biomass, other sources. And then in terms of the percent of in-state versus out-of-state generation, that's not data I have on hand at this moment, but again, certainly something that I would be happy to follow up with someone to answer.
Okay, thank you. Let me see what else I have here. There was a question about affordable housing and solar development related to affordable housing, and whether there's been any consideration in your state of using the RPS to encourage development of solar at affordable housing?
Warren, this is Linda. I can take a stab at that. We don't have anything specifically in the RES, nor have I heard any conversations in that regard, but we did pass legislation last year as part of the comprehensive package to include community remote net metering that includes provisions to work with Rhode Island Housing, our quasi-public, with low-income and moderate income renters to help those tenants procure remote solar at a reduced cost. And we also have another docket here at the PUC where we're looking at a bunch of issues, and one of the things is to ensure that low-income ratepayers and moderate-income ratepayers have access to renewables and efficiency. So it's certainly something that we consider and we look at, but there is no one single comprehensive piece of legislation, nor has it been raised as part of the RES.
Okay, well, I've gone through the questions that have come in. I want to give each of you an opportunity to take 1 or 2 more minutes, if you like, to say anything else you would like to say that you haven't had a chance to say up till now. Do you have either of you have anything you want to add?
I would like to echo some of the statements Rebecca made about a collaborative approach to move forward and how we're going to meet RES obligations. And those conversations and discussions do continue in Rhode Island. They're not formalized in a separate docket, but it is something that the PUC is aware of and will continue to look at and reach out to stakeholders and the utility as issues arise.
And this is Rebecca. Yeah, I would just add that, you know, we, as I said, we're really have a strong appreciation for a lot of the questions and the unknowns, and I strongly suggest that anybody who is curious about what's going on in Oregon or wants to talk more, to please don't hesitate to reach out to me and to use me as a resource.
Hey, thanks very much. I want to applaud both of you for your very good presentations and for the information you gave about how you're approaching the state RPS. But more important than that even, I want to applaud the 2 states of Oregon and Rhode Island, which really have stepped forward and have come up with ambitious and impressive RPS plans, and many people will be watching to see how you do in the future. You know, I'm sure you'll be successful, but we'll be interested to watch that success and then applaud that. So thanks everybody for joining us on today's webinar. We'll be sending you notices of future webinars. There will be more. Bye now.